imagine for a second, you are a medical executive, right?
Correct.
And you have this brand new drug in development. And a pilot study comes across your desk, 30 patients, and it shows like a 56% success rate.
That sounds pretty promising.
Right. But do you spend $1 billion taking it to market based on that?
Yeah.
Or what if you're a policymaker and some newly published paper shows that implementing a specific tax, cuts crime by 10%?
Oh, yeah, the classic policy dilemma.
Exactly. Like, do you restructure the entire economy based on that single paper? Today, learner, we are going to show you why those exact scenarios could be, well, massive statistical illusions.
The kind that end careers.
Yeah. And ruin lives, frankly. Yeah. We are diving deep into the architecture of scientific truth today, and we are not going to hold your hand through the basics.
No, we really aren't, because we are looking at a huge stack of sources covering advanced quantitative research methods like sampling methodologies, statistical hypothesis testing, and even the mechanics of meta-analysis.
The heavy hitters.
Right. We're looking at how data is gathered, how it's validated, and honestly, how researchers systematically attempt to just destroy their own theories to see if they hold up.
And the reason you, the learner, need to care about this is that we are constantly bombarded by data-driven claims, right? Claims that demand our money or our votes or just our attention.
Oh, absolutely. Every day on social media.
Yeah. Understanding the mechanics of how populations are sampled or how power is calculated in a test, it's the ultimate intellectual armor.
It really is. I mean, a headline that reads, "Coffee cures everything" is, well, it's essentially weaponized data.
Weaponized data, yeah.
I like that.
Because if you don't understand the underlying epistemology and that statistical scaffolding that supports the claim, you are entirely at the mercy of whoever wrote the headline.
Right. You're just taking their word for it.
Exactly.
So to understand the numbers, we really have to start with the philosophical foundation that allows those numbers to even exist in the first place.
Right. The paradigm of inquiry. Yeah. I want to look at the positivist paradigm. If you're a positivist, you basically view a human subject like a chemist views a rock.
A rock, right.
Like the rock doesn't change its molecular structure just because the chemist is looking at it. But, I mean, that feels like a necessary operational delusion when we're talking about humans, doesn't it?
Operational delusion is a really fantastic way to phrase it. Because in philosophy, classical positivism...
Like Auguste Comte and those guys.
Yeah, exactly. Driven by figures like Comte. It operated on this assumption of absolute realism. Like there is one objective reality and the researcher is just completely detached from it.
Just a fly on the wall.
Right. But modern quantitative research actually operates under what we call post-positivism. They acknowledge your exact point. Human beings aren't rocks.
Shocker.
Right, shocker. Human measurement is inherently flawed, and just the researcher's presence inevitably introduces some noise.
Okay, so the post-positivist accepts that reality is messy. But they still refuse to abandon the idea that an objective truth is out there, right? They just admit their measuring tape is a little blurry.
Precisely. They use deductive reasoning. So you start with a grand theory, you carve out this highly specific, testable hypothesis, and then you deploy standardized instruments.
Like what?
Like validated psychometric questionnaires or blinded experimental trials. You do that to see if the data actually conforms to the theory.
Right.
And you do all this while striving for what the axiology of this paradigm calls a value-free state.
Okay, let's unpack this. Is a value-free state actually possible? I mean, an astrophysicist measuring the velocity of a comet, sure, they can be value-free. Gravity doesn't really care about the physicist's political affiliations,
No, it doesn't.
But if you were a sociologist designing a survey on, say, wealth inequality, the very questions you choose to include or even exclude those are laden with your personal values.
You're hitting on the core tension of axiology in the social sciences. Because the critical paradigm...
Like feminist or Marxist research.
Exactly. The critical paradigm argues that value-free research is a total myth. And therefore, research should be explicitly value-laden, designed to emancipate marginalized groups.
Right. They lean into it.
Yeah. But the quantitative post-positivist takes a completely different approach. They admit bias exists, but instead of leaning into it, they try to mathematically and methodologically quarantine it.
Quarantine the bias.
Right. They use double-blind designs, pre-registered hypotheses, and these incredibly rigid sampling frameworks to ensure their personal values just can't infect the data collection process.
Okay, well, that quarantining process starts with who you actually measure. Which brings us right into data sampling.
A huge topic.
Yeah, if I want to map the behavioral patterns of every smartphone user in a country, I obviously can't track millions of people. I have to sample them.
Right.
And the sources heavily emphasize that true probability sampling is the only way to avoid just catastrophic selection bias.
Absolutely. In probability sampling, every single member of the target population has a known non-zero chance of being selected. The foundational method here is simple random sampling.
So it's just, what, drawing names from a hat?
Well, not quite. I mean, a hat implies a really small scale, right? And an easily mixed population. When you're dealing with a population of 10 million, true randomness is a massive logistical and computational headache.
Because humans are terrible at being random, right?
Oh, we're awful at it. If you ask a human to pick a random sample from a list, they'll subconsciously avoid picking names that are alphabetically right next to each other.
Oh, like picking two Smiths in a row feels wrong.
Exactly. Or they'll unconsciously favor certain demographics. True simple random sampling requires assigning a unique identifier to every single unit in the population and then using cryptographic random number generators to extract the sample.
Wow. Okay, but that assumes you have this perfect omniscient list of all 10 million people in the first place.
Yeah.
That seems incredibly rare outside of, like, a heavily regulated national census.
It is very rare.
If you're just a private researcher, you definitely don't have that list.
Which is exactly what forces researchers to use stratified sampling.
Okay, how does that work?
So if you know the demographic makeup of a population, say, a specific city is 60% female and 40% male,
Right.
you divide your sampling frame into those strata first. Then you perform the random sampling within those specific groups.
Okay.
That ensures your final sample perfectly matches the population's proportionality.
Okay, that makes proportional sense.
Yeah.
Because if you just run a pure random number generator on a small sample size, you might accidentally pull a sample that's like 80% male, purely by statistical variance.
Exactly. Just bad luck.
So stratification forces the sample to mirror the known reality.
Right. It artificially suppresses the variance of the sample to increase its representativeness. But even then, stratification doesn't solve the geographic problem.
What do you mean?
Well, if you're doing an in-person observational study across a massive geographic area, like, say, the American Midwest. Yeah. Stratified sampling might demand that you send researchers to 400 different, totally isolated farms just to measure one person at each location.
Oh, man. The travel budget alone would bankrupt this study.
It really would. And that is exactly where cluster sampling becomes mandatory.
Cluster sampling. So you group people up.
Basically, instead of randomly selecting individuals, you randomly select naturally occurring clusters.
Like what?
Like entire schools or specific zip codes or entire hospital wards. So you randomly select 5 zip codes out of 100, and then you just sample every single relevant person within those 5 zip codes.
Okay, but doesn't that inherently damage the randomness? I mean, people who live in the same zip code probably share socioeconomic statuses, environmental exposures, maybe even similar diets, right?
Yes, they absolutely do.
So you're increasing the homogeneity of your sample, which means you aren't really capturing the true diversity of the larger population.
That is the exact mathematical trade-off you have to make. Cluster sampling introduces what statisticians call a design effect.
Design of.
Yeah. Because individuals within a cluster are naturally more similar to each other than to individuals in other clusters, the variance of your estimates actually increases.
Okay, so how do you fix that?
Well, to maintain the same statistical power as a simple random sample, a cluster sample requires a significantly larger total sample size.
To compensate for that intra-class correlation.
Exactly. You save tons of money on travel, but you pay for it in sample size requirements.
Got it. Okay, there's one more probability method mentioned in our sources. Systematic sampling, which is picking every nth person on a list, right?
All right.
Let's say you're auditing an assembly line, and you test every 50th widget. That seems really efficient, but it also seems incredibly dangerous if the list has, like, a hidden periodicity to it, like picking every 10th person in line at a concert.
Oh, the concert line analogy is perfect.
Yeah, what if every 10th person happens to be the one holding the tickets for their friend group? Doesn't that introduce a weird pattern?
It's highly dangerous. Or, taking your widget example, if the machine producing the widgets has a subtle defect that only manifests on every 50th rotation of a gear.
Oh, wow.
Your systematic sample will either capture a population of 100% defective widgets or 0% defective widgets.
Depending entirely on where your random starting point was.
Exactly. You will completely miss the true, say, 2% defect rate. The researcher has to rigorously prove that the sampling frame is entirely unordered relative to the variable being studied.
Okay, but all of this simple, random, stratified, cluster, systematic, it all assumes the population is visible and countable. It assumes everyone is standing in the light.
Yeah.
But what happens when the population is actively hiding from you?
That is a major challenge.
Right. You can't randomly sample undocumented immigrants or people engaged in illicit financial trades or, individuals with heavily stigmatized health conditions.
You really can't.
You don't have a list, and frankly, they don't want to be found. That basically forces us to abandon probability sampling altogether.
It does. It forces the use of non-probability sampling, where the probability of any one person being selected is completely unknown. And the moment you do that, you sacrifice strict statistical generalizability.
So you can't confidently calculate a margin of error.
Exactly.
You can't.
Then why do we even accept it in the scientific literature?
Because in a lot of cases, zero data is worse than biased data, provided the bias is openly acknowledged. The most notorious method here is convenience sampling.
Oh, like testing undergraduate psychology students because they're essentially captive in a lecture hall.
Exactly. It's cheap, it's fast, but it's epistemologically very weak. A much stronger non-probability approach, especially for those hidden populations you mentioned, is snowball sampling.
Okay, I've heard this described as a snowball rolling down a hill picking up more snow. But honestly, that metaphor feels totally inadequate to me.
How so?
It's less like a snowball and more like, I don't know, mapping a dark cave system. You can only find the next cavern by following a tunnel from the cavern you're currently standing in.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, you find one participant and you rely entirely on their network of trust to illuminate the next participant.
I much prefer the cave metaphor. You are actively leveraging social capital to bypass the barrier of stigma.
Right.
If a researcher just walks up and approaches a sex worker for a study, the answer is usually going to be no. But if another sex worker vouches for the researcher, the answer might be yes.
But wait, doesn't that just map an echo chamber?
In what way?
Well, if snowball sampling relies on friends referring friends, aren't you just getting a sample of people who all think exactly alike? You aren't studying the whole cave system. You're only studying the connected caverns.
That is absolutely a valid concern.
Like if a subgroup of that population is totally isolated from the network you started in, you'll just never find them. You're studying the network, not the population.
And our sources explicitly list that as the fatal flaw of traditional snowball sampling. It heavily oversamples individuals with large social networks and completely misses isolated individuals. It lacks diversity.
So how do researchers fix that?
Well, modern methodology has evolved this into something called respondent-driven sampling, or RDS.
RDS. Okay, what does that do?
RDS uses complex mathematical weighting based on the size of each participant's personal network.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So if a participant knows 50 other people in the hidden population, their data is weighted mathematically less than a participant who only knows 2 other people.
Oh, so it mathematically corrects for the network bias.
Exactly. It brings a non-probability method shockingly close to a true probability sample.
That is fascinating. We leverage the bias mathematically to basically cancel it out.
We try to, anyway.
Okay, so once we have our sample, whether it's through a rigorous cluster design or this respondent-driven sampling, we have to actually extract the data from these people.
The data collection phase.
Right. And the sources spend significant time on data collection tools, specifically questionnaires, interviews, and psychometric tests. And this is really where validity and reliability come into play.
Yes, because designing a survey is not just, writing down a few questions.
Right. It's not a BuzzFeed quiz.
No, it's constructing a scientific instrument. And that instrument must be both reliable and valid.
Okay, I want to break those two terms apart because they are constantly conflated by people. So if validity is about accuracy, like actually measuring what you intend to measure,
yes,
then I'm assuming reliability is just about mechanical replication, like a broken clock.
A broken clock?
Yeah, a clock that's frozen at 3:00 p.m. is highly reliable, right? Because it gives you the exact same output every single time you look at it. But it is totally invalid.
That is the perfect distinction. It really is. In psychometrics, reliability is often measured using something called Cronbach's alpha.
Cronbach's alpha sounds intense.
It tests internal consistency. Let's say you have a 20-question survey designed to measure clinical depression. A highly reliable survey means that if a patient answers strongly agree to the statement, I feel sad, they should also answer strongly agree to I lack energy.
Because those concepts are linked.
Exactly. The items hang together mathematically. That's high reliability.
But the validity of that survey is much harder to prove, isn't it?
Oh, much harder.
Because what if your survey on, say, employee productivity is actually just measuring employee paranoia about being monitored by the boss?
Right.
The data will look incredibly reliable, everyone answers the same way, but your conclusions will be a complete fiction.
And that's why establishing validity requires rigorous triangulation. You need face validity, like does it look right to experts? You need construct validity, does it correlate with established theories?
Right.
And you need criterion validity, does the survey actually predict real-world outcomes? The American Psychological Association's standards for testing, assessment, and evaluation, they explicitly warn against using unvalidated instruments.
You can't just base a massive quantitative claim on a survey you drafted on a napkin the night before.
You really can't, though some have certainly tried.
I'm sure. Okay, so even if you have a perfectly valid instrument and you have a flawless probability sample, the way you actually crunch the numbers can still completely betray you.
Oh, we're getting into the math now.
We are. Let's move into the core engine of quantitative analysis, hypothesis testing. This is where we actually try to prove things.
Except, in classical frequentist statistics, we never try to prove that we are right. We only try to prove that the null hypothesis is wrong.
Okay, that counterintuitive logic is honestly the hardest thing for people to grasp.
It really is a mind bender.
So the null hypothesis is basically the baseline assumption of absolute zero. Zero effect, zero difference, zero correlation.
Exactly.
So if you introduce a brand new educational curriculum, the null hypothesis states that it will have exactly zero impact on student test scores compared to the old curriculum.
Yes. It assumes the status quo remains unchanged.
Any difference you observe in your sample is just, what, statistical noise?
Just dumb luck. It's the ultimate skeptical baseline. Against the null, you place your alternative hypothesis, which is your actual theory.
Right, that the new curriculum actually improves scores.
Right. So you gather your data and you compute a test statistic, like a z-score or a t-statistic.
Which essentially measures how far your sample data deviates from that null hypothesis, usually measured in standard errors.
Exactly. And that test statistic generates the most famous and probably the most misunderstood metric in all of science, the p-value.
So what does this all mean? We see p-values constantly. P less than 0.05, it's treated like a holy grail in journals. But what are the actual mechanics of a p-value? Because it doesn't mean there's a 5% chance your theory is wrong.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And that's the most common misconception. A p-value is the probability of observing data as extreme as yours or more extreme, assuming the null hypothesis is completely true.
Okay, so using the curriculum example.
If your new curriculum study yields a p-value of 0.03, it means that if the curriculum truly had zero effect if the null was true, you would only see this much of a score jump in your sample 3% of the time, purely due to random chance.
Oh, okay. And because that probability is so low below the arbitrary threshold of 0.05 zerzia, we reject the null hypothesis. We declare the result statistically significant.
You've got it.
But wait, you just called the 0.05 threshold arbitrary? Why do we hold it in such high regard if it's just a historical artifact?
It dates back to Ronald Fisher, one of the founding fathers of modern statistics. He essentially just suggested 1 in 20 as a convenient benchmark for noticing something interesting.
Wait, really? Just a convenient benchmark?
Yeah, it was never meant to be this immutable law of physics. The American Statistical Association has actually issued massive warnings recently against treating 0.05 as a cliff edge.
Where 0.049 is pure scientific truth and 0.051 is utter garbage.
Exactly. It's a false dichotomy.
Because it creates a binary illusion of truth. And that binary illusion forces us into statistical errors. Let's talk about the alpha and beta seesaw, because if we reject the null hypothesis based on a p-value, we can still be completely wrong.
Yes. You face two main types of errors. A type I error, or alpha, is a false positive.
Good.
You reject the null hypothesis when it is actually true. You claim the curriculum works, but it was just a fluke in your sample.
Right, so your alpha level is the threshold you set, usually that 0.05. You are explicitly accepting a 5% risk of publishing a false positive.
Precisely.
So let's put this in medical terms, which is a type I error and which is a type 2 error if we are testing someone for a disease.
Okay, great analogy. A type I error, the false positive, is telling a totally healthy person they are sick. It's a false alarm.
That's alpha. So beta, the type 2 error, must be the misdetection.
Correct. A type 2 error occurs when you fail to reject the null hypothesis, even though it is false. So in medical terms, it's telling a sick person that they are healthy.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, you completely miss the disease. In research, it means the curriculum actually is brilliant, but your study fails to detect it, and you falsely conclude it has no effect.
Okay, well, why not just set alpha to 0.0001 then? Why not demand overwhelming, near impossible levels of evidence before we claim something is statistically significant? That would eliminate false positives almost entirely, right?
It would, but you can't do that because of the seesaw effect.
Seesaw.
If you crush alpha down to 0.00001, making it incredibly difficult to reject the null hypothesis, you inevitably force beta to skyrocket.
Oh, I see.
By becoming absolutely terrified of a false alarm, you guarantee a massive wave of false negatives. You will miss subtle but very real effects.
Wow. So in medical trials, a false positive means approving a useless drug. But a false negative means abandoning a drug that actually cures the disease.
Exactly. You have to balance the ethical cost of both errors.
And the complement to beta, the ability to successfully avoid a false negative, is called the power of a test.
Right. The power is simply 1 minus beta. If you have a 20% risk of a type 2 error, your test has 80% power.
Okay, that makes sense.
And power analysis is one of the most critical steps in research design. Before you even collect one single data point, you must calculate your required sample size to achieve adequate power, usually 80% or 90%.
So power depends on what?
3 things: your alpha level, your sample size, and the expected effect size.
Okay, let's unpack effect size, because it often gets totally overshadowed by the p-value. A p-value only tells you if an effect exists, right? It doesn't tell you if the effect actually matters.
That is a crucial distinction. Let's say you have a sample size of 1 million people. With a sample that massive, you will have the statistical power to detect an incredibly microscopic difference.
Right.
You might find a p-value of 0.000001 showing that a new diet pill causes people to lose, say, 0.1 ounces of weight over a year.
0.1 ounces. It's highly statistically significant, but it's clinically worthless. Nobody cares about a tenth of an ounce.
Exactly. That is why researchers use metrics like Cohen's d to measure the standardized effect size. It measures the magnitude of the difference regardless of sample size.
Oh, I see. So a p-value tells you the signal is real. The effect size tells you how loud the signal actually is.
Beautifully put.
So we have our p-values, our effect sizes, our power calculations. We've balanced alpha and beta. But the sources dive deeply into threats to validity that have absolutely nothing to do with math.
The human element.
Yeah. We can have perfect math and still produce absolute garbage science if the human element corrupts the process.
We are talking about bias and methodological integrity here. And honestly, the most systemic threat to the entire scientific endeavor right now is publication bias.
The file drawer problem.
Yes.
Because journals want to publish exciting, groundbreaking discoveries. They want that p-value under 0.05. If a researcher runs a massive, rigorous 2-year study testing a new behavioral therapy, and the result is a perfectly calculated null finding.
Meaning the therapy does absolutely nothing.
Right. The journals just don't want it.
No, they don't. And because they don't want it, the researcher just leaves the paper in their file drawer. The problem is, if 20 different labs test that exact same useless therapy, 19 might correctly find nothing and remain unpublished.
But one lab.
Yes, one lab, purely by statistical variance, that 5% alpha risk we talked about, will find a false positive.
And that one false positive gets published. And the public thinks a new miracle therapy has been discovered, completely unaware of the 19 hidden failures in the file drawers.
It deeply distorts the aggregate reality. And worse, it heavily incentivizes researchers to engage in p-hacking.
P-hacking, like massaging the data.
Essentially, if my p-value is 0.06 and my entire career depends on getting it under 0.05 to get published, I might be tempted to subtly alter my data.
Oh, wow.
I might exclude a few outliers or run the analysis 10 different ways until I find the one configuration that finally dips below 0.05.
But p-hacking completely destroys the validity of the hypothesis testing framework, right? Because the 0.05 threshold only mathematically holds if you ask a single question of the data once.
Exactly. If you interrogate the data 20 different ways, you are practically guaranteeing a false positive. This is why the ethical standards, like those from the ICMR, now heavily emphasize pre-registration.
Which is where you publish your exact methodology,
Right.
your hypothesis, and your statistical analysis plan before you even gather the data.
Right. You lock yourself in so you can't shift the goalposts later.
That's smart. It ties the researcher's hands. But beyond researcher bias, the sources also emphasize funding bias.
Mm.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When reading quantitative research, assessing the purpose of the study from the CRA test is critical.
The CRA app test: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose.
Right. So if a massive, mathematically rigorous, randomized controlled trial shows that a new pharmaceutical drug is vastly superior to the generic alternative, but the study was entirely funded by the pharmaceutical company that holds the patent,
It raises some eyebrows.
how do we approach that? We can't just dismiss it entirely because of the funding, but we clearly can't accept it blindly either.
Well, methodologists use sophisticated frameworks to audit the science. You don't just look at the funding source, you look at how the funding could have subtly influenced the design.
Like what?
Like, did the pharma company use an inappropriate comparator? Did they compare their drug against an artificially low dose of the generic drug just to guarantee their drug looked better?
Oh, that's sneaky.
Very. Tools like the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool, or ROB2, they systematically evaluate trial design, missing data handling, and selective outcome reporting to mathematically score the likelihood of bias.
So it's essentially a forensic audit of the study's architecture.
Exactly.
And speaking of ethics, the sources touch on how modern technology is creating entirely new ethical minefields. The APA guidelines stress informed consent, which, was easy to understand when you were bringing people into a physical lab.
Right, they just sign a piece of paper.
But what about archival data? What about researchers scraping millions of public social media posts to analyze linguistic patterns of depression?
Oh, it is a massive debate right now. From a strict positivist standpoint,
Right.
public data is just observational data. You aren't interacting with the subject, so you don't need their consent.
But from an ethical standpoint, specifically the principle of non-maleficence, those users didn't consent to have their painful, vulnerable thoughts aggregated into a data set.
They didn't. Institutional review boards are currently struggling to define whether scraping a public forum violates the expectation of privacy. It is an absolute methodological Wild West right now.
It really is. Okay, so let's pull back and look at the macro level.
Yeah.
We've analyzed how individual studies are designed, sampled, tested, and audited for bias.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But as we established with the file drawer problem, no single study can define reality. One study is just a single pixel. To see the whole picture, researchers have to aggregate everything.
Through systematic reviews and meta-analyses.
Right. A meta-analysis is basically the apex of quantitative evidence. It's a statistical technique that combines the numerical results of multiple independent studies into a single massive calculation.
Yeah. Yes. But to run a meta-analysis, you have to actually find all the studies first.
Which is easier said than done.
Much easier said than done. It requires advanced literature search strategies. The sources outline databases like Scopus and Web of Science. You can't just type, "Does a caffeine improve memory?" into Google and call it a day.
So what do you do?
You have to use Boolean logic, AND, or not, but you have to go much deeper than that too. You have to use controlled vocabularies.
Controlled vocabulary.
Yeah. If you are searching PubMed, you use me-sh terms, medical subject headings. This is a hierarchical tree. It ensures that if one paper uses the term adolescent and another uses teenager and a third uses youth, the database pulls all of them simultaneously under a single conceptual tag.
Oh, wow. That prevents you from missing crucial data simply because someone used a synonym.
Exactly. And you also have to fight index bias. Web of Science might heavily favor English language journals from the US and UK. If you only search there, you are systematically excluding global research.
So you have to search multiple databases, track citations forward and backward.
And proactively search for gray literature. Conference abstracts, unpublished dissertations, you need those to counteract the publication bias we talked about earlier.
Right, finding those file drawer studies. Okay, so once you have extracted the data from every valid study, you run the meta-analysis. And this is where the mathematics get truly elegant. You mentioned earlier the problem of aggregating apples and oranges. How do you combine a study of 50 people taking 100 milligrams of a drug with a study of 500 people taking 200 milligrams of the same drug?
That feels like statistical alchemy, doesn't it?
It does. The variances must be completely different.
They are, and that is exactly why meta-analysts use two different statistical models, the fixed effect model and the random effects model.
Okay, what's the difference?
A fixed effect model operates on a very strict assumption. It assumes there is only one true underlying effect size in reality, and all the studies in your analysis are estimating that exact same truth.
So the only reason the studies have slightly different results is purely due to random sampling error.
Exactly.
So under a fixed effect model, the larger studies get vastly more weight in the calculation, right? Because their larger sample sizes mean they have less sampling error. They are closer to the true number.
That's right. But in the real world, the fixed effect assumption is almost never true.
Because the studies are slightly different.
Right. The populations have different ages, the interventions have slightly different intensities. There isn't one single true effect. There is a distribution of true effects.
Which requires the random effects model.
Yes. The random effects model accounts for two types of variance. It accounts for the random sampling error within each individual study, but it also calculates the heterogeneity between the studies.
Oh, clever.
It introduces a parameter, often denoted as tau squared, which represents the variance of the true effect sizes across the different populations.
So how does that change the math? If I'm reading a meta-analysis using a random effects model, what does tau squared actually do to the result?
Because it acknowledges that the true effect varies, it essentially penalizes the precision of the overall estimate. It widens the confidence intervals.
Making it more conservative.
Exactly. Furthermore, it alters the weighting. In a random effects model, the massive studies don't dominate the calculation quite as heavily as they do in a fixed effect model. The smaller studies retain slightly more weight because they are viewed as providing information about a slightly different facet of the overall distribution of effects.
That's a much more humble, realistic, mathematical approach to a messy world.
It is.
And researchers visualize this complex aggregation using a forest plot. I've seen these in papers. It looks like a massive grid with lines and squares of different sizes.
The forest plot is a masterpiece of data visualization.
How so?
Well, down the left axis, you have the list of every study included. For each study, there is a horizontal line spanning across a central vertical axis. That horizontal line is the confidence interval for that specific study. The wider the line, the smaller the sample size, and the greater the uncertainty.
And sitting somewhere on that line is a square.
Yes. The position of the square shows the specific effect size found by that study. The physical size of the square represents the mathematical weight that study was given in the meta-analysis. A massive study gets a massive square.
And the vertical line going down the middle of the entire graph.
That is the line of no effect, the null hypothesis. If a study's horizontal confidence interval line touches or crosses that vertical null line, it means that individual study was not statistically significant.
But the real magic of the forest plot is at the very bottom, right?
The diamond.
The diamond.
Yes. The diamond represents the aggregated meta-analyzed result of all the combined studies. The center of the diamond is the overall pooled effect size, and the width of the diamond is the overall pooled confidence interval.
And because you've pooled, what, thousands of patients across 20 studies,
Okay.
that diamond is usually incredibly narrow.
Very narrow. The statistical power is massive. If that diamond sits completely clear of the vertical null line, you have established one of the highest levels of scientific evidence possible.
You have basically neutralized the random variance of individual samples and isolated the underlying truth.
It is the closest thing to objective reality that quantitative research can possibly produce.
Wow. But once you have that reality, you have to communicate it. You have to publish it. And our sources dedicate a surprising amount of text to the mechanics of formatting and citation, specifically the tension between APA, AMA, and Vancouver styles.
Formatting wars.
Yeah. I always viewed citation formatting as just an arbitrary torture device for graduate students, like a hanging indent here, an italicized comma there.
It definitely feels that way when you're writing it.
Right. But if you look closely, the formatting rules are actually a cultural reflection of the discipline's epistemology.
That is a brilliant way to interpret it. Let's look at the American Psychological Association, the APA style. It is an author date system. In the text, you see parentheses with the researcher's name and the year of publication. Why? Because in the social sciences, temporality is critical context.
Right. A sociological paper on remote work, written in 2019, is measuring a fundamentally different reality than a paper on remote work written in 2022. The discipline prioritizes knowing when the observation was made, so they force the year into the main text, right in your line of sight.
Contrast that with the American Medical Association, AMA style, or the Vancouver style used in biomedicine. They use tiny superscript numbers or bracketed numbers in the text. You don't see the author's name and you don't see the year unless you hunt for it in the reference list at the back.
Because in medicine, the epistemic priority isn't the sociology of the author. The priority is the unencumbered delivery of the intervention's efficacy.
Exactly. A doctor reading a trial on a new beta blocker doesn't want the paragraph cluttered with parenthetical names. They need the biological data as fast as humanly possible. The formatting physically accelerates the reading speed.
The formatting is designed to optimize the transfer of the specific type of knowledge that discipline values most. It isn't arbitrary at all.
Not at all.
Well, we have journeyed through an incredibly dense architecture today. We started by acknowledging the operational delusion of positivism, treating humans as measurable objects while deploying strict deductive reasoning.
We examine how researchers use cryptography and proportionality to pull true probability samples out of the void, and how they use respondent-driven mathematical weighting to illuminate hidden populations when probability fails.
We looked at the absolute necessity of instrument validity, ensuring we aren't just reliably measuring our own broken assumptions. We put the null hypothesis on trial, understanding that the p-value isn't a measure of truth, but a measure of surprise.
We balance the alpha and beta seesaw, calculating the precise statistical power needed to avoid the tragedy of false negatives. And we talked about actively auditing the literature for p-hacking and funding biases using frameworks like Cochrane-Robb 2.
And finally, we aggregated the noise. We combined the variance of thousands of people using random effects models and forest plots to forge a single powerful diamond of truth.
It is a monumentally rigorous, almost paranoid system of checks and balances designed to prevent human beings from fooling themselves.
Which is exactly why Karl Popper's concept of falsifiability is the perfect capstone for this entire methodology.
Falsifiability. It sounds like an accusation of fraud.
But in the philosophy of science, it's the ultimate badge of honor.
It is the dividing line between science and dogma. Popper argued that a theory is only scientific if it is structured in a way that allows it to be proven mathematically and empirically wrong.
So if your theory is so vague or so heavily insulated by excuses that no possible data could ever contradict it, you aren't doing science. You're doing theology.
Precisely. If I say the stock market will fluctuate over the next decade, that is impossible to falsify because it's so broad.
But if I say if the central bank raises interest rates by exact 50 basis points on Tuesday, this specific sector index will drop by 3% within 48 hours, I have made a highly specific, dangerous prediction.
You have handed the universe the exact mathematical knife required to kill your theory.
And that is the courage of quantitative research. Researchers spend years designing the perfect stratified sample, validating the perfect psychometric instrument, and calculating the exact power of their test. Not to guarantee that they are right, but to ensure that if they are wrong, the data will clearly and undeniably reflect it.
They build the scaffolding specifically so it can bear the weight of its own destruction. That willingness to be refuted is what makes scientific knowledge deeply, profoundly reliable.
The certainty we have in science isn't beautiful because it's an unquestionable dogma handed down from an authority. It's beautiful because it has bravely stepped into the arena of the null hypothesis a billion times, and it has survived every single rigorous mathematical attempt to falsify it.
Well said.
So, learner, here is a final provocative thought for you to carry into the rest of your week. Think about a deeply held belief you possess, something you consider to be an absolute undeniable fact about how society operates, or how human behavior works, or even a conviction you hold about yourself.
We all have them.
We do. Now look at that belief through the lens of everything we've unpacked today. Is that belief actually falsifiable? What specific, measurable, empirical data would you accept that would force you to completely abandon it?
If you cannot articulate the exact conditions under which you would admit you are wrong, is it really a fact?
Or is it just a deeply protected feeling? The true intellectual armor isn't knowing you are right. It's knowing exactly what it would take to prove you wrong. Keep auditing the methodology, keep questioning the t-values, and we will see you on the next deep dive.